See all them waves there? Look how muddy the water got. See? That's land. It's in liquid form.
More than anything else, in my opinion, the Mississippi River Gulf outlet has been the linchpin to the demise of our coast. To me, what it's done that's been the bigger damage has just been progressively like a cancer, eating away at the coast for decade after decade after decade. Storm surges, even for little rinky-dink tropical storms and Category 1 hurricanes, are all of a sudden we've got a tremendous storm surge at the back door of Metro New Orleans. And certainly with Katrina, well, the truth is in everything that's happened since then.
Well, the Great Wall you see behind me was built to help protect the city from hurricane surges. And the reason it was needed was because of the MRGO.
The MRGO has had a double whammy. It's provided a route for the hurricanes, and it's also destroyed the adjacent marsh, which had acted as a buffer for these storms coming up.
It's a disaster waiting to happen.
The reason we want to close the channel is because it's a straight shot into New Orleans.
I followed the money trail, looked to the port of New Orleans.
In the final analysis, this was the atomic bomb. This is the one that really got St. Bernard Parish.
You'll hit a storm one of these days, they'll call it 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 years. It'll go over the top of your 18-foot levee. And then you'll have thousands and thousands of people drowning and destroyed. And we are in a position now to stop that by closing that MRGO completely.
A channel from the Gulf to the city was a long-time dream. And in fact, one of the reasons Bienville founded the city where it was because of Bayou St. John. It provided access to Lake Pontchartrain for the city and a direct route to the Gulf of Mexico. So it was much more economical to come directly into the port rather than trying to navigate 70 river miles twisting back and forth, and also that with shifting sandbars. So the MRGO in that case made sense from an economic standpoint, but of course it never fulfilled its mission for many reasons, one of which is we didn't have the locks to get these big ships into the river. You know, the industrial canal, that part of it really never worked.
When people came to realize what a horrible mistake it was far too late to undo what's happened since M.R.G.O. was built.
Shame on us if we hadn't learned some lessons through the years, and I think the closure of the Mississippi River Gulf outlet is a perfect example. I think we need to be open, we need to be humble, we need to admit that when we're wrong, we're wrong.
We can use everything as a learning experience. What can we learn from this? Okay, this thing is closed now. It's closed at both ends. The nation's going to spend millions, if not eventually billions of dollars trying to repair some of this damage. This work is going to be ongoing. The question we need to ask ourselves, the important thing going forward, is how did this happen? You know, why are we here? Why was this necessary, this wall? Why is the tens of millions necessary to try to rebuild what's left of the eastern St. Bernard Parish marshes?
You know, flying over the MRGO again, it reminds you, what a large channel, what a big scar it is on the landscape.
So what's it looking like up there this morning? What did you see?
We did see some of the projects that are completed, the rock dam at Bayou Lucha. We also flew over the surge barrier, which basically addresses the funnel effect where surge and Katrina was funneled into the heart of New Orleans in the industrial canal, flooded communities like the Ninth Ward. So the surge barrier is a very impressive feature to see even from the air. It's extremely important to protect New Orleans and address a large amount of the flood risk from the MRGO.
Why this wasn't done before the hurricane? Why did we have to wait? You always heard about how, what's going to happen when you get the perfect storm. Why didn't we prepare for it? And this wasn't the perfect storm.
People here have to look in a mirror if they want to know why some of these problems haven't been taken care of. These public resources are managed by Congress. And we send congressmen to Congress. They represent us. And our own representatives were not in favor of closing this. They fought, just like they do now, fighting the oil and gas regulations that would better protect the coast and wetlands. So everyone wants to know why this isn't, why this was done, why wasn't it addressed sooner. Look in the mirror, because you know how these people are voting, and you keep sending them back to Congress or to Baton Rouge.
The people here on the coast, they want it the most. They care the most about restoration. They have the most at stake. They are extremely passionate. The level of passion that's there, and care and concern and commitment to the coast and restoration and finding solutions to sustain the culture and the way of life here is just never, ever falters. It's always very consistent.
I can't give them hard scientific data. All I can give them is what I live with every day. I come out and I see this gauge, I look at my tide chart, and because we've got a little depression in the Gulf, this gauge says my water is a foot higher than the tide chart says it's supposed to be. Well, you tell the people that want to know that, and they say, well, that can't be. So what do you do?
It's difficult because sometimes you have so much passion, and you have people that have different perspectives and different interests in the coast that are all committed to it, whether it's recreational or it's commercial fishing or it's navigation or it's just their land that their family has owned for decades. You have to, find the way to restore that, because it's all at risk, and do it in a way that works for everybody.
I'd say it's a bad experiment. It's gone bad. The idea of creating this shipping channel through miles of virgin, productive wetlands really would be almost unthinkable today.
There's a nice channel, 76 miles long, through 3 parishes, Eastern Orleans, St. Bernard, and Plaquemines parishes. Actually, it bisects directly through 40 miles of wetlands, which used to be the heart of St. Bernard Parish.
When you dredged a canal from Breton Sound, salty Breton Sound, right into the heart of this estuary, it's like taking a spear and just stick it into someone's heart. I mean, that's taking the poison right into the heart of this ecosystem.
Early 1960s, that was the first time there actually some state and federal agencies actually expressed some concerns about the ecological impacts of the outlet while it was under construction.
Sherwood Gagliano, Woody Gagliano, who remains an active scientist to this day and was probably, for the science community, leading the debate against the M.R.G.O. Woody and his colleagues were pretty sure that the M.R.G.O. was going to at some point destroy the eastern half of New Orleans, and the question was when.
You know, Woody, you're rightfully known as the grandfather, first the father, now the grandfather of coastal concerns in Louisiana.
The first thing we did was challenge a long-standing belief that the Delta was still building land, that the land was growing every year. That was gospel.
Even though the levees had been completed by the mid-1930s, even though the river was shut off from the marsh, they still felt that it was building, at least on the Birdfoot.
That's correct. And also, we launched on measuring land loss for the first time, and determined that at the end of the day, we studied maps from 1890 to 1960, about the last edition that was available. And we determined that the land loss rate was 16.5 square miles per year.
None of this should have been news to anyone, because if you research the Corps of Engineers' first abstract on this proposal, on the first page of this abstract, the Corps says dredging this canal will have a serious change in the tidal flow and salinity into Lake Pontchartrain. No one was thinking then that this was our storm surge protection. And very few people at the time were even considering this is the most productive estuary outside of Alaska in North America.
You have to look at the whole picture. I think of us as a port of national significance, and The reason I say that, there is no other place in the world, with the exception of Shanghai, China, that has the accessibility to a country like we do. So that gives us the largest market area in the United States. When you look back, I can remember working with Junior Rodriguez at the time. When you look at people like Junior, who was the parish president of St. Bernard, I listened. He pointed out where the saltwater intrusion was taking place and where there used to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres of oak trees and cypress trees.
We're talking way beyond just wetland impact. We're talking about a cultural and historical character of St. Bernard, which has been altered forever by the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, and it's unlikely it's ever going to be come back to the way it was before the MRGO.
Land loss, some of the real impacts. These numbers actually are from the Corps of Engineers. Documented data, fresh and intermediate marsh, 3,400 acres lost. Brackish marsh, 10,300 acres destroyed or severely altered. Saline marsh, 4,200 acres destroyed.
At that time, kind of felt like you're beating your head against a wall, that basically there were a lot of pushback that the channel would never be closed.
It was dredged on our behest, and it was decades before the damage this thing was doing was really taken seriously.
The ideas of 1950s guided the construction and operation of the flood protection system around New Orleans for 40 years, when they were known to be inadequate after 10 years.
The Port of New Orleans must compete for business with the ports of Houston, Baltimore, New York, Seattle, and many other subsidized ports.
That thing was authorized in Congress in 1956. Started construction in 1958. That shows you the fact that they wanted this thing in a hurry, and they got it.
The congressmen from Louisiana and the business community here are the ones who wanted the M.R.G.O dredged. It was going to be a boon for the port, for the economy of this area, and for the shipping industry.
Congress authorized to construct a channel that was 36 feet deep. That was supposed to be the deepest section of the channel. Top width was 650 feet, bottom width was about 500 feet.
In 1956, it was for a super channel to be a whopping 36 feet in depth. That is absolutely nothing by today's standards.
Is they painted such a beautiful picture of the economic factors involved with this Gulf outlet that it was hard for the local representatives. Shucks, I don't know. If I'd have been here, maybe I'd have even fell for that one, you know?
Oh, there were going to be multiple jobs, you know, but they only got one.
They envisioned businesses along the Gulf outlet. They even had a proposed highway that would parallel the channel. They had one time proposed a ferry, and they were not going to disturb the people in Shell Beach. All of those things never did occur.
All the landowners that own all this, man, they were tickled to death because their land gonna be worth so much money, you know. But as you can see, it's not worth anything. You can't build anything out here.
The MRGO was always sort of a lost leader in terms of it needed to be dredged constantly. The ships didn't like it. It was hard to maneuver in it, and they had to go slow. They continued to use the Mississippi River as a preferential route.
The only vessels that you would have continued to see out there would have been poultry vessels and vessels that were built years and years and years ago and that now are becoming more and more obsolete. You're just not seeing ships or vessels that small anymore. So the option of going back to the Mississippi River is one that would have happened anyway.
Now, I say this was 500 feet wide. Now it's over 2,000 feet. And then when I say over 2,000, I'm not talking about the bank line here might be 2,000, but when you go back into these lagoons and all, you might be going back in there another block, a block and a half, because any little strip of land that you had separating the lagoon from the channel has disappeared.
Wetlands are important, folks. You better conserve these. They're very important to the country. And we had a total shift in national policy. The policy prior to that in Louisiana had been called dredge, drain, and reclaim.
When this thing was dredged, it was solid marsh. The land was at least where the boat is, and it was as high as this boat. But this is a sinking, starving delta, so not only do the shorelines erode away, but it's sinking as well. So now we've got a much deeper and wider channel.
Ship wakes were the biggest cause of the widening of the canal. We did field studies for the state, for the Department of Natural Resources. But the wakes pounding on these soft sediments were tremendous. You know, it's like, wham! The first time we went out there, the boat was swamped.
These ships will carry a wave sometimes as much as 15 feet, you know, and they'll suck 10 feet of water out of this bayou when they pass, you see, and all that's got to come back, you know. It's going out and coming back at the same time, you know, and it'll flip them, you see. Just a boat sitting still right there, you know what I mean, and flips it over.
You know, we now recognize that as being a kind of a pumping effect.
Sure.
There's an old saying, when the tide comes in, it comes in clean. When it goes out dirty.
You talk about these big ships making waves, but when you talk about hundreds and even thousands of sports fishermen and commercial fishermen going up and down it, that wave action is far more than that ship action is. And on top of that, when you have a tide that comes in and goes out, it's like a big file. As it goes in, it tears some of the bank off, it falls in. As it goes out, it carries it out there and puts it in the Gulf, and that goes on continuously. In the meantime, your land is washing away.
Late 1980s, early 1990s, that's the first time that the MRGO was referred to as an environmental nightmare, and certainly it is. 1993, the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation's Comprehensive Management Plan identified the Mississippi River Gulf outlet as a major environmental problem for the Pontchartrain Basin and recommended its closure.
The Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation may have been the first group in this area to represent the people outside, let's call it the wetlands industrial complex.
We advocated for closure of the MRGO. The Corps of Engineers was really just going through the motions just to satisfy people, with maybe a few very small exceptions. There were people like Sue Hawes, a great lady. She helped write a report in 1999 that pretty much objectively laid out the direct impact of the MRGO, quantify them. That was a very significant technical report. Didn't get anywhere with changing the MRGO, at least in the pre-Katrina situation.
The Corps being an instrument or arm of the government that is mainly in charge of water resources planning, management, and execution, we are totally objective in the position we have with regard to any of the projects that we operate or happen to be planning in the future. The reason is because we don't operate like a business who tries to make a profit on the projects that they work on. We are directed under a mission that we're provided, and we carry forward the directives from Congress on what we're authorized and funded to do or not do, or reverse, perhaps in the case of the MRGO, if it were ever the case that a project modification would come into play, we would take directives on those modifications.
1998, the Louisiana, the state's Coast 2050 plan recommended closure of the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. Shortly thereafter, QIPR, the federal plan, actually recommended closure also. Late 1998, St. Bernard Parish requested EPA to facilitate planning for the closure of the MRGO. June of 1999, at the request of St. Bernard Parish and Congressman Tozan, the EPA convenes the MRGO Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Task Force to actually facilitate the planning of the closure.
It was very difficult for the Corps to ever accept that an authorized project needed to be shut down.
The first thing is they have to close it. But before they close it, just to say, well, it's closed, they have to fix it. If they don't do that, if you just say, well, it's closed, no ships are going to go in it no more, it's still there. It don't go away.
I got, I think, 3,300 signatures on petitions of all the people in the area to want to close M.R.G.O.
We had several big meetings at the council chambers, and it gets real hot, and then it just evaporates. And so I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think after we lose a lot of lives, then I think they'll do something about it.
Early 2000, the Corps of Engineers begins a Mississippi River reevaluation study, a study to determine if it is feasible to close the Gulf outlet. Late 2000, MRGO reevaluation economic report completed.
The main purpose of this study originally is to find out if maintenance of the project is still, feasible. If your maintenance cost is going high every year, and you compare that to the benefits, is that channel still justifiable?
Prior to Katrina, we had 9 constituents, if you will, or 9 customers located on the Inner Harbor who were all utilizing the Mississippi River Gulf outlet and needed the M.R.G.O for their businesses. It so happens that these 9 businesses directly employed a little over 1,000 workers and indirectly employed 9,000 workers. So that is an economic consequence that we didn't take lightly. We obviously sided with our customers in wanting to keep the access open.
The deep draft users need an alternate route to get through the facilities, and by constructing the IH&C lock will give them that ability to use a different route. So any recommended plan that we approved, meaning headquarters, will have to wait for implementation until the IH&C lock.
The only problem I have with the Corps is sometimes they have a tendency to play with the figures and make things look better than what they are. And that's one of the things that I think has kept this Gulf outlet open, and that's one of the things that I think is going to close it. They can't justify much longer. They can't justify it now.
From the beginning of this study, we've been trying to work with the task force and trying to gain consensus that that is the best way to approach this, because you have to be worried about the concerns of the navigation industry. You can't just ignore them and just be one-sided.
We totally understand and empathize with the residents of St. Bernard Parish and the ecological and environmental issues at stake. We are not against closing the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. However, because of the commerce and because of the economy, we're looking for a balance of scale at the end of the day. Now, be that in the form of completion of the Inner Harbor lock, hopefully at an escalated pace, that's the ideal solution. We originally looked at a 10 to 12-year completion of that project, somewhere around 2012, 2013.
The Corps of Engineers and the Port of New Orleans, which is a local sponsor for this, want to keep the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, the M.R.G.O open until they can design and float in the new lock, okay? And we have a problem with the new lock because of the bigger ships and the much larger and wider barge tows turning around in the Mississippi. Ships and the barges carry things that are too dangerous for road or rail. Well, this is happening in our community.
It's a balance. You have a navigation portion and an environmental portion. I think most of the stakeholders are concerned with the environmental impacts of it, and that's one big portion of it. So whether we close it or not, you will have that ecosystem restoration part. We truly believe that the M.R.G.O does not impact the flooding in the area, but you have a responsibility to address that. We can say we're going to close it because the Lake Pontchartrain Basin wants it that way. We have to study, make sure that is the right solution, and also while doing that, you have to make sure that you balance interests, and that's the purpose of our process.
St. Bernard Parish, the Dock Board, the Congressional Delegation, the City of New Orleans, and all of the other parishes in the Greater New Orleans, Inc. group need to come together on this project and help us to find a solution for maintaining deep draft access to Jordan and France Road. We see that right now as being the Inner Harbor Lock. If we can get Congress on track and we can all rally together rather than in opposite directions and against each other, this has got to bode really well, and it would be a huge Louisiana win.
Our position is that any ecosystem restoration plan that is approved will proceed to implementation before the agency lock, because we don't see a reason why to stop that side of it. So as regarding to the channel, you can wait to close it until the agency lock is built, but proceed with your environmental features. So it's kind of a win-win situation.
I think the lessons learned from M.R.G.O. is things that appear to be great may not always be great if you examine them carefully. And one of the best devices for doing that is still a good, solid environmental impact analysis. And if that were done properly, and we would live within the guidelines of NEPA and other legislation that's already on the books, we wouldn't have half of the problems that we have now.
I've always had the utmost respect for the worker folks, and whether it's in New Orleans District or anywhere in the Corps. The problem I've had with the Corps all along is it's a dinosaur. It's one of the worst bureaucracies on the planet. And unfortunately, while they've got the right data and they know what to do technically, more often than not, a political decision will be made that compromises or overrules that initial recommendation.
So what we did is we reached consensus with the Environmental Task Force Committee, because besides the task force, you have 5 more subcommittees. And after 3 meetings, we came to an agreement that out of the 20 proposed plans, you know, we had only 8 will walk into a more detailed feasibility study.
I see over and over again, when we have a sensitive topic of this type, we create a study group, and the study group convenes a workshop, and they pull in a group who's going to sugarcoat the message. You know, instead of coming out, you shouldn't build in this area because there's a fault here. And if you build a bridge on top of that fault, it's going to fail. Or if you build a levee on top of it.
Policy is how people make decisions about what to do and not do. And science hopefully informs those decisions. What I've seen most of the time is that there's a pretty clear divide between those two provinces.
We have to get it in the hands of the people who are making the decisions, and without the sugarcoating. We can't have an agency come back and undermine the good science, because it's a slippery slope.
We have a very objective stance on where the project lies, and again, we try to be as sensitive as possible to environmental interests and local residents, and it's our primary mission to strike a balance between those interests and water resources areas such as navigation, to provide equity between all those areas as a mission for the Corps.
Who are the stakeholders? Well, there's the oil and gas industry, there's the fishing industry, there's a recreational fishing industry, there's a development industry, there's a shipping industry. Those are the stakeholders. Well, wait a minute. What about the rest of us? What about the 1.2 million people living here in Southeast Louisiana, 99% of whom do not work in those industries? Stakeholders are always people who make a living off this public resource. But most of the stakeholders who aren't consulted depend on this resource to make their life better, and in some cases to have life. We're not at that table. because we don't have a financial interest. We don't make money off of this. And to me, that's been a great weakness and fallacy in this whole system.
What I get a kick out of is they hold all of these meetings, public meetings. You're spinning your wheels talking at these meetings because you already know what they got in their mind to do. There's just so many things that's wrong with the way that the Corps is handling these things. And Congress listens to the Corps. Congress does not listen to the average guy. They listen to the Corps.
The issue at hand right now is a very weak and devastated Corps of Engineers budget at the Washington level. The Army Corps of Engineers has been in trouble now for 5 or 6 years from a budgetary standpoint. A lot of projects have been questioned. I was told in one of my meetings with the Corps that they're operating from an operation and maintenance standpoint at 65% of the level that they need from a budgetary standpoint.
Perhaps we're not moving as fast as we could, and one of the reasons is the funding situation. We do have a lot of constraints. Many of our studies are shut down, and but I've been lucky with the M.R.G.O. since it's so highly visible. We have continued this study with some funds, but not as much as I wish to. But we are proceeding.
Their role is expanded into other areas other than the traditional Corps of Engineers, operation, maintenance, and new construction, flood protection, and dredging of channels for navigational purposes. Their projects have increased 50% in the last 6 to 7 years, and their budget has decreased 35% in the last 10 years.
This back and forth with the Corps continued right up till 2005 when Hurricane Katrina struck, and events unfolded pretty much as we predicted. At this point, we had a good hydrodynamic model, so we could see what was going to happen, and we could see the things that we were concerned about actually happening before they happened. And it was, as an oceanographer, it was reassuring to me to see that I was right. On the other hand, it was very disturbing to see that all the oceanographers in the world could have no effect on this policy-bound organization, and that so many people had to die because of it.
That Gulf outlet is just like a double-barrel shotgun aimed right straight at the city of New Orleans.
Nobody disagrees that the M.R.G.O. could potentially be a major passageway for a hurricane that can do incredible damage to the Pontchartrain Basin, just shooting up the M.R.G.O.
If the levee ever breaks, then everything is going to flood on the inside of the levee, and we're all going to drown like rats in a bucket of water.
New Orleans is in terrible shape if a major storm ever comes.
In Hurricane Betsy, we had 80 people die, and it was in the city of New Orleans. The city of New Orleans, I just can't seem to get none of the elected officials interested in the fact that they are really at risk. Everything that you do in St. Bernard, you have to keep the Gulf outlet open because it's a revenue source, and the job you're going to lose and the tax you're going to lose. But what about when you lose New Orleans?
They had it before, all St. Claude and Claiborne and everything else was flooded. Well, that's only a little bit, is what will happen when we get a real one, when we get the real McCoy.
And when hurricanes come, then they get scared. Then they're worried. And where are the people in the city of New Orleans going to go? They can't get out the city. I mean, it's a shame to say it, man. And there's no way that they can take care of these people. There's no way that they can shelter these people. It's almost a physical impossibility. But yet, doesn't seem to be a priority in the city of New Orleans.
It took a hurricane in this category to wake people up. to finally get something done on this side of the river as far as restoration of the land, trying to save the wetlands. We have projects going on now where they're going to start rocking Lake Bowen. We have projects now where they're building levees and they improving the levees. Why this wasn't done before the hurricane? Why did we have to wait?
The American way is to wait for things to break and then fix it. You can only do it in a ridiculously wealthy country because it's the most expensive route to pursue.
People didn't realize the danger we had back there and what could happen if we had a storm or the wind blowing in the wrong direction. Now they know. They saw what happened, they realized what could happen, and we were telling them this all along.
If Katrina hadn't came through, if 129 people hadn't died in St. Bernard Parish and 1,200 in the city of New Orleans, the M.R.G.O. would still be open. The maritime interest would still be happy. The sad part about it is those people, even after those people died in Katrina, tried to keep the M.R.G.O. open.
We went to some pretty rough meetings following Katrina. It was a situation where there was a lot of acrimony. There were personal threats to people involved. If you weren't on the right side, you were threatened in some instances in the parking lot before or after meetings. But those are things that you expected. You knew they were coming. And you can understand, not only expect it, you could understand how people felt. They had just lost everything. Everything was totally gone. Families totally relocated, many of whom today are still not home and may never come home.
I couldn't find no place to live over here. There was no place to live over here. Past hurricanes, you go 5 miles up the highway and they had places you could live. You go 50 miles up the highway now and you can't find a place to live. But the longer you keep people out of their area, the comfortable they get someplace else. They find jobs someplace else. The kids go to school someplace else. They don't want to just pull the kids out and come back to St. Bernard and say, well, okay, we're back.
The Corps of Engineers, who were authorized to dig the channel and maintain it in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, they were still planning to dredge it and keep it open. It seems absurd at this point to think of that, but they were literally designing the reopening of the M.R.G.O., dredging it out while they were literally still rescuing people in New Orleans.
When we released our report in 2006, highlighting all of the issues, it was shortly after that Congress acted to actually have closure of the navigation channel. That was a huge, huge step, something that folks didn't anticipate, happening. The folks that have been working on this issue for many, many decades.
Everybody here is welcome and encouraged to participate. If you're not at the table and you have something to say, just simply either raise your hand or stand up and please join in. That's the purpose of us being here this morning, is to make sure that all the stakeholders get an opportunity to state their case and to try to work with everybody else here to reach some agreements about how we proceed on the study that we've got at hand.
In 6 weeks, there's going to be not much evaluation that can be conducted. But you all have been studying this for many years prior to Katrina and have a lot of good scientists and good designers involved. There are previous federal studies, so our intention is to obtain and include all the information that exists on these various plans, and in particular the commonalities.
Following Katrina, the M.R.G.O. silted into 22 feet and became unusable for deep draft navigation at that point. And that was the first nail in the coffin to the end of the M.R.G.O. at that particular point in time. We gave little or no effort whatsoever after Katrina to attempt to reopen or save the M.R.G.O. at that point. We knew that we had to explore other options.
If a new lock were in place, the shallow draft folks would still like an alternate route through the M.R.G.O. that would require at least 12 feet of depth. Is that what?
That is correct.
It became a very sensitive issue to discuss because of the vast amount of losses that took place and understandably so.
We've got to get the coast back to self-sustaining condition. If we don't do that, it doesn't matter if we've got a 14-foot channel, a 28-foot channel, a new lock, no lock whatsoever. This region is shot. I think all of us have said we got one more chance to do it. It's this time. Please, folks, if we can, I'll get off the soapbox. If we can leave this as the foundation and let the science go.
If there aren't jobs, nobody's going to be here to benefit from this anyway.
I hear you, but if there's no region here, there's not going to be any jobs.
If there's no public safety, there's not going to be any jobs.
Wait, please, let's not. Exactly. We all lost a lot of blood.
But we're bringing the jobs back now. We don't have time to
guys, recognize we're not trying to cut you out. There's been a hell of a lot of blood on the floor in this room and all over the place. And sometimes, you know, in the past, I ain't gonna go there. I'm not gonna go there. If we gotta stay, we gotta build a consensus. And the whole thing that, please, folks, please keep in your mind, if we don't do something with the damn coast, we're shot.
The issues and the acrimony of the past, whether or not it's a good thing for New Orleans or a bad thing for New Orleans, I think it's all a moot point now. People can still argue, but it's no argument left. It's been dammed off to deep draft navigation right below Bayou La Loutre. You never see it again, in my honest opinion.
The bottom line is we came down to answering the call from Congress for closing off deep draft navigation, and this particular design does that. It prevents navigation up and down the channel. We did look at things like a navigable lock that could be opened and closed, but the economics are just not there for the channel any longer, and so the determination was it's better to close it permanently. That's loud and clear what we heard from the people in St. Bernard Parish when we met with them the numerous times we did in developing this plan.
I think already we're starting to see regrowth in areas north of there where there was saltwater intrusion before.
The construction of the rock closure across the channel, we've seen salinity levels in the estuary drop about 50%, and that's very good for the estuary as a whole, and also sets the stage for future coastal restoration work in southeast Louisiana. Sue Haas, who's no longer with us, but was very, very instrumental in having the closure put in place, had studied the area for years, and it was one of the things that she expected to happen, and we've seen that come to fruition. We see now plants that are able to grow in the estuary that for years and years couldn't withstand the levels of salinity and are now starting to return to the basin.
The core plan has a lot of work in the central wetlands, and I think that's a lot due to the community voice and the community being very engaged. The state master plan, they did call for a river diversion going into the central wetlands, which is critical for the cypress restoration because you have to bring salinities down and maintain them. They did not have the actual areas that would have, you know, cypress restoration in the plan, and that was something that our coalition commented on. We actually generated, I think, about half of all comments received on the entire master plan. We said we would really like to see this area in the plan, and the state, you know, kudos to the state, they went forward and they worked it in there. So we have this area is in the state master plan for Cypress.
This is the Bayou Bienvenue Triangle, and as you can see, this is an area that once was something very different. It was once a cypress swamp. And that tells you a couple of things right away. One is that it was fresh water, and secondly, that the elevation of the land was at least about 3 feet above the water. Something changed here over the last 50 years, and a big part of that change was the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. Now that the outlet's been closed, community leaders, neighborhood folks, are trying to figure out what they can do with this area. Because it's not just an old cypress forest. There are streets and lots that are platted beneath it. This is part of a neighborhood. The real question is, what's its future?
Before '65, we had fun back here. We used to get crawfish in a little drainage canal down here, which they covered up with cement. And we used to catch, you know, rabbits, raccoons, squirrels. And now, you know, we can't catch nothing but, you know, redfish and a drum and catfish because the water is black as water now. So it's coming back better than it was because I caught a couple of perch in here a few months ago.
Well, if you had any lessons you wanted to teach anybody from this, what would it be?
Well, I would, that's hard to say. I don't know what to tell them now, but I just hope they could bring it back like it was. But I probably won't be here when that happens.
If people think that it's not important to engage, if they think that their voice is not important, then you lose a lot. In today's world, that's how it works. You know, that's how you affect change. You have to engage, and so you should never discount whatever level you want to engage in.
Optimism is one thing, blind faith is quite another. And when your faith is being subsidized by the lives and futures of others, it comes with moral responsibility. And I think that that is what we have learned here, is that the fate of this coast, this city, and many things beyond New Orleans in Louisiana turn on whether we are able as a people to think faster, learn from experience, and in fact be honest about the risks we're running, not only with our own lives and fortunes, but those of others.
The Mississippi River Gulf outlet is closed. Is that good? I think it's good. Is it good for the port? I think it's good. Because the next thing we know, in years to come, the next wetland, the next frontier will be Canal Street. There will be no New Orleans. So I think it's an element of, for the sake of saving the city, for the sake of saving all of the culture around us, particularly down in Plaquemine and St. Bernard Parish, it was a good thing.
You do have small boats that use the system for recreation and commercial fishing, but no longer do you see deep draft vessels from the Gulf coming in and out of the port through this area. And so you no longer have ship wake erosion along the banks of the channel. And so that is a reduction that we've seen since 2009. But the story's still out on the rest of it, because the system is stressed by a number of things. It's not just the canal that was built here, it's all the other factors that contribute to coastal erosion.
To deal with the issues of the MRGO, about $2 billion has been spent. To build the surge barrier was almost $1 billion, and then the walls around St. Bernard and part of New Orleans East, about $2 billion for a population that will never return to what it was before the storm. So we spent an awful lot of money to get back half of what we had. And that's, as I said, that's the American way. You know, it takes a disaster to move things, and then we'll spend unlimited amounts of money. But the idea of actually planning ahead, even though we have many people involved in planning, it really doesn't happen.
We just have a master plan on the table for coastal restoration that's going to cost $1 billion a year at a minimum for the next 50 years.
If we're all angry enough, or if we all get the right science, and if we all get the right engineering together, that will make things different. But when you're dealing with things that are written into law, new science does not change old law. New community expectations do not change old law. People have to change old law. And that's what ultimately happened on the MRGO. It's not there anymore, legally, because people deauthorized it. Now, deauthorizing was not merely alone enough. You had to simultaneously make sure that the resources and commitments were there to fix some of the damage that had been done. The Corps now says they're ready to do that. When will it happen? We'll have to wait and see. But the only guarantee is a committed and engaged community. There are no substitutes.
The Chief of Engineers has signed his recommendations for the MRGO plan. So the next steps are to have the Congress review the plan, to authorize elements of it, and then appropriate dollars for its implementation. If you read in the details of it, we have a 10-year period of time that we believe that it will take to construct it. Now, a lot of that is dependent on how much funding we receive and the priorities that are placed in partnership with the state of Louisiana.
It should be a partnership between the Corps and the state. That's what it should be, and that's what we want to encourage, because that's the way that we're going to get this done.
Congress directed the Corps of Engineers to do a study of the MRGO to determine a restoration plan. In civil works projects, there is normally a cost share split between a local sponsor and the federal government. That's usually 35-65. The legislation that was written in 2007 suggest to most people that the intention here was different, that the 100% of the cost would be carried by the federal government.
Attorneys on both sides, have different perspectives. Part of those 49,000 comments we sent in, the number one thing on that was that they need to be present, they need to move forward, they need to not let this interpretation of legislation stop a project that's so important that needs to be done.
The restoration plan that the Corps has designed has cost $3 billion. If Louisiana say, okay, yeah, we'll do our cost share, that's $1 billion obligation. So that's a very serious, large amount of money and an important obligation. So the state has taken the position that it should be 100% federal. Unfortunately, what it means is that the project is now at this essentially approaching a standstill.
The need for restoration transcends the policy issue, and it's not fair, and it's not good government to let this fall to the side because of dispute, because people can't come together to figure out a way forward. I think both sides really want to see it move forward. Maybe not as much as the community wants to see it move forward, but there's a commitment there to not let it go on the shelf. And I'll tell you that if it does go on a shelf, they will be hearing from our groups loud and clear.
Let's take dredging as an example. That's about the clearest I can think of. In 1986, Congress passed the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund are ad valorem taxes collected on all imports into the United States. That fund generates about $1.7 billion a year, yet Congress chooses to only appropriate $700 to $800 million a year for dredging our ports and harbors throughout the United States, at all 300 plus ports in the United States. That's not good. And where's the rest of the money going? To balance the budget? I doubt it. Is it in some surplus somewhere? No, nobody can find it. My point is, to say that the Corps has a backlog, the Corps does have a backlog, but the Corps doesn't necessarily need to have a backlog. If the funds that were congressionally approved in 1986 were legally, ethically, morally, and rightfully used for their intended purposes and no other purpose, we wouldn't have the dredging issues that we have today. The Office of Management and Budget, like so many other agencies, has oversight over the Corps of Engineers. And I will tell you that the administration was actually fair in the proposed budget that they put out this past year for dredging. But by the time the Office of Management and Budget finishes it, the Corps doesn't get anything that remotely resembles what the White House sent over. I have no doubt in my mind.
Without naming villains, because I think we're all villains for allowing this to happen, if we review this again, we see people in high authority with good credentials denying the results of credible science. People were drowned. We're losing sight of the fact that well over 1,000 people drowned because of negligence to address those problems.
Absolutely.
And not just negligence, but arrogant negligence. And that's what we're recording here. We're recording an era in our history where the trusted people to make those decisions in dealing with natural hazards failed. They not only failed, they lied about it. That's unacceptable. That hurts. That's what I come away from this process with.
We were wrong. We were wrong. I don't know how else to put it. It's working out. It hadn't been easy. No, and it hadn't been cheap. But at the end of the day, it's going to work out. It is working out. Otherwise, we wouldn't have just come off of 3 record years in the port.
I often wonder if people who live in this area understand that they live in one of the most endangered, perilous landscapes in North America. And I'm not just talking about towns like Grand Isle or Cocodrie or Dulac or Delacroix. I'm talking about New Orleans and Mandeville. I'm talking about Uptown and Lakeview. I'm talking about Ponchatoula and Madisonville. And that's because of what's happening to the delta. At the same time, the sea is rising. And it's until people realize that, until they accept that, and understand they have to learn to live sustainably here and take these issues seriously, then they're not being realistic about the chances of their children and grandchildren having a safe future here.
Mr. Go, you know you gotta go. Mr. Go, you brought me way down low. Mr. Go, we know you gotta go. Mr. Go, it dealt a big old blow. 20 feet of water on my crown. Mr. Go, you bringing me down. Cypress swamps used to be. Mr. Go, it broke their knees. St. Bernard and Plaquemine, oh, and not coming back again. I don't know what's been said, Mr. Go, you